The mafia boss's daughter kept crying in first class, until a black single mother did the unthinkable. The infant's scream sliced through the pressurized silence of the first-class cabin like a jagged blade. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated distress that made the elite travelers in their plush leather seats flinch and tighten their grip on their champagne flutes. But despite the mounting irritation, not a single passenger dared to summon the flight attendant. Not when they looked at the man in 2A. Shin Kyungmi sat like a statue of carved obsidian, his broad shoulders filling the seat. He wore a custom-tailored black suit over a silk dress shirt, the collar slightly open to reveal the edges of traditional ink, shadowy dragons that spoke of a lethal, underworld pedigree. His jaw was set with a tension that could crush bone, and his sharp, defined cheekbones were shadowed by the dim cabin lights. To the world, he was the untouchable sovereign of the Shin Syndicate. But in this moment, the man who controlled the city's pulse was paralyzed by a force he couldn't intimidate. Panic. A raw, unfiltered desperation flickered in his dark eyes as he stared down at the bundle in his arms. His daughter, Shin De-yeon, was only 3 months old, but she was already a storm he couldn't weather. Her tiny face was flushed, her mouth open in a tireless wail for a mother who was no longer there to answer. It had been 3 months since the light had left his wife's eyes, leaving Kyungmi with a legacy of blood and a child he didn't know how to save. "Sir," his lead enforcer leaned in from the aisle, his voice a low, frantic whisper. "The pilot can make an emergency landing. We can have a medical team meet us on the tarmac." "No," Kyungmi's voice was a low growl, wrapped in silk-covered steel. "We arrive on schedule. She won't stop." But baby De-yeon didn't care about syndicate schedules or the fear her father inspired in grown men. She only knew the hollow ache of hunger and the cold absence of a mother's touch. Kyungmi had tried everything, the designer bottles, the temperature-controlled nursery water, the pacifiers she spat back at him with surprising ferocity. Across the aisle, Tasha Brenda watched the scene with a heavy heart. Wearing a simple gray shirt, her dark hair pulled back into a soft, natural ponytail, she looked every bit the weary traveler. But beneath her calm exterior was the soul of a woman who knew the weight of a child's cry all too well. She saw the emperor in the black suit, but more importantly, she saw the drowning man. While the other passengers looked away in fear, Tasha did the one thing no one in Kyungmi's world ever did. She stood up, ignored the hand the bodyguard moved toward his jacket, and stepped into the lion's den. The heavy, pressurized air of the first-class cabin felt like it was vibrating, held in a state of crystalline fragility by the infant's relentless screams. Shin Kyungmi looked down at the tiny, thrashing bundle in his arms, feeling a sense of failure more profound than any tactical defeat he had ever suffered in the back alleys of Seoul or the corporate boardrooms of Los Angeles. He was a man of iron and ink, a man who commanded legions with a flick of his wrist, yet he was currently being unmade by 7 pounds of flesh and bone. Every time baby De-yeon's lungs drew in air to let out another jagged, soul-piercing wail, Kyungmi felt a literal ache in his chest, a phantom pain that mirrored the hollow space left behind by his wife's passing. He tried to adjust the cashmere blanket, his large, calloused hands appearing clumsy and grotesque against the delicate fabric. He offered the bottle again, the premium formula that had been prepared to the exact degree of lukewarm perfection, but De-yeon only screamed harder, her tiny mouth wide and trembling, her eyes squeezed shut in a portrait of pure, infant misery. His lead enforcer, a man who had taken bullets for the Shin family without flinching, was now sweating, his eyes darting toward the other passengers who were huddled in their seats like sheep in the presence of a wolf. They all knew who Kyungmi was. They had seen the news reports of the syndicate's reach, the whispers of the dragon of the West Coast. The aura of violence that usually served as Kyungmi's greatest weapon was now a cage, isolating him in his own desperation. No one would help. No one would dare approach. The silence of the observers was a vacuum that made De-yeon's cries sound even louder, even more condemning. Kyungmi felt the heat rising in his neck, the dragons tattooed there seeming to writhe as his pulse quickened. He was drowning on dry land, and the only person who mattered in the world was suffering in his arms. Across the aisle, Tasha Brenda felt the cries in the marrow of her bones. It wasn't just the noise, it was the specific frequency of the infant's distress, a sound she had heard 1,000 times in the neonatal units where she used to work, and a sound she had heard in her own home before the silence had become permanent. She watched the man in the black suit. She saw the way his knuckles were white as he gripped the armrest, the way his jaw was working in a desperate rhythm. She saw the tattoos and the expensive suit, and she saw the bodyguards who looked ready to snap the neck of anyone who breathed too loudly. Any sane person would have stayed buried in their book, eyes fixed on the clouds outside the window, praying for the flight to end. But Tasha wasn't just any passenger. She was a mother who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and she knew that the baby wasn't just fussy. Diane was exhausted, hungry for a connection that a plastic nipple and a cold cabin couldn't provide. Tasha took a slow, grounding breath. She looked at her own hands, then at the man who looked like he was about to shatter into 1,000 pieces. Without a word, she unbuckled her seatbelt. The metallic click seemed to echo like a gunshot in the tense cabin. Immediately, the enforcer in the seat behind Kyungmi shifted, his hand moving with practiced fluidity toward the interior of his jacket. His eyes went cold, locking onto Tasha with predatory focus. Kyungmi himself didn't look up, his forehead resting against the baby's forehead, his eyes closed in a silent prayer to a god he hadn't spoken to in decades. Tasha didn't stop. She stepped into the aisle, her movements fluid and devoid of any aggression. She kept her hands visible, her palms open. She wasn't a threat, she was a bridge. "Stop right there," the enforcer hissed, his voice a low, lethal vibration. Tasha didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Kyungmi. "She's not going to take that bottle," Tasha said, her voice calm and melodic, a sharp contrast to the jagged atmosphere. "She's looking for the only thing she knows she's lost. You can fly this plane to the moon, and she'll still be crying when you get there." Kyungmi's head snapped up. His eyes were bloodshot, the cold calculation of a mafia boss replaced by the raw, jagged edges of a grieving father. He looked at Tasha, this woman in a simple gray shirt with skin the color of deep mahogany and eyes that held a lifetime of understanding. He saw her natural ponytail, the lack of jewelry, the lack of fear. It confused him. Everyone feared him. It was the foundation of his existence. "Go back to your seat," he rasped, though the command lacked its usual bite. "I'm a pediatric nurse," Tasha lied, or perhaps she just leaned into the truth of who she used to be before the grief had taken her license to care. "And I'm a mother. I can help her, Mr. Shin. But you have to let me." Kyungmi stiffened at the mention of his name. His enforcer moved to stand, but Kyungmi raised a single, trembling hand to stay him. He looked at his daughter, whose cries were becoming weaker, turning into the ragged, breathless gasps of an infant who was reaching the end of her strength. It was the gasps that broke him. The sound of a child giving up. He looked back at Tasha, his gaze searching hers for any sign of deception, any hint of a trap. He found only a profound, quiet empathy that mirrored his own hidden pain. "What do you want?" Kyungmi asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I want her to eat," Tasha replied simply. She took the final step, entering the small radius of his personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and cold steel, mixed with the milky, sweet scent of the baby. Tasha reached out. It was the most dangerous thing she had ever done, reaching into the arms of a man who killed for a living to take the thing he valued most. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The enforcer held his breath, his finger likely on a trigger. The other passengers watched through the cracks in their fingers. Kyungmi felt a strange electricity as Tasha's hands brushed his. Her skin was warm, a living heat that seemed to thaw the ice in his veins. Slowly, almost defensively, he loosened his grip. He allowed her to slide her arms beneath the baby, supporting the small head and the tiny, trembling back. As Diane was transferred from the rigid, terrified hold of her father to the practiced, rhythmic cradle of Tasha, the baby's crying shifted. It didn't stop, but the pitch changed from a scream to a whimper of confusion. Tasha sat down in the empty seat directly across from Kyungmi, never breaking eye contact with the man. She knew the unthinkable act she was about to perform. In his world, in his culture, what she was about to offer was more than just food, it was a sacred bond, a mixing of essences that could never be undone. But she didn't care about the politics of bloodlines or the pride of syndicates. She only cared about the life in her arms. "Turn around," Tasha said to the enforcer, her voice firm. Then she looked at Kyung-mi and you need to shield us. Not from the world, but for her. Give her a moment of privacy in all this noise. Kyung-mi, the man who never took orders, found himself moving instinctively. He shifted his large frame, using his broad shoulders and the dark fabric of his suit to create a wall between Tasha and the rest of the cabin. He was the fortress, and for the first time in his life, he was protecting something beautiful rather than something broken. Tasha adjusted the baby, shielding the infant with her own body and a light shawl she pulled from her carry-on. With a practiced, maternal grace, she guided Diyun to her breast. The infant struggled for a second, her tiny face searching, her instincts taking over. And then, the miracle happened. The cabin, which had been a war zone of sound for over an hour, suddenly fell into a heavy, stunning silence. The only sound left was the rhythmic, desperate swallowing of a hungry child and the soft, shushing sounds Tasha made against the baby's temple. Kyung-mi watched, his breath hitching in his throat. He saw the way Diyun's tiny hand, previously clenched into a fist of rage, slowly unfurled, her fingers resting against Tasha's skin. He saw the tension drain out of his daughter's body as she found the nourishment and the warmth she had been denied since her mother's heart had stopped beating. He looked at Tasha, and for the first time, he didn't see a passenger or a stranger. He saw a savior. Tasha looked down at the baby, her own eyes filling with tears she hadn't expected. The familiar pull of a child nursing brought back a flood of memories, of her own son, of the nights she had spent in the dark, praying for just one more moment of this connection. She was giving Diyun life, but in the quiet of that first-class cabin, the baby was giving Tasha something just as vital, a reason to feel again. She was so empty, Tasha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Kyung-mi reached out, his hand hovering near Tasha's shoulder before he pulled it back, as if afraid his touch would contaminate the purity of the moment. "You saved her," he said, the words sounding heavy and foreign in his mouth. "Why? You know who I am. You saw the tattoos. You saw my men." Tasha looked up, her gaze steady and unafraid. "I didn't see a boss, Mr. Shin. I saw a baby who was hungry and a father who was breaking. Tattoos don't change the fact that a child needs to be held." Kyung-mi leaned back, the carved obsidian of his exterior finally cracking. He watched the woman and the child, the black mother and the Korean heir, bound together by an ancient, primal act of mercy. He knew right then that his life had changed. The trajectory of the Shin Syndicate, the wars with the rival families, the rigid traditions of his ancestors, it all felt small compared to the silence in the cabin. He had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, but this woman had simply walked through them with nothing but a broken heart and a gift of grace. As Diyun drifted into a deep, milk-drunk sleep, her small weight settling against Tasha's heart, the plane leveled out, soaring through the moonlight. Kyung-mi stayed in his position, the guardian of the quiet, his eyes never leaving Tasha. He didn't know her last name, he didn't know her story, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty, he was never letting her go. In the world of the Shin Syndicate, debt was everything. And he had just incurred a debt that could only be paid with his life, his loyalty, and perhaps, a heart he thought had died 3 months ago. The flight continued in a newfound peace, a temporary sanctuary in the sky, while below them, the shadows of his old life waited to see what would happen when the dragon finally found something worth more than power. Tasha felt the weight of his gaze, a mixture of reverence and something darker, something possessive, but she didn't flinch. She simply held the child tighter, a single mother who had done the unthinkable, unaware that she had just become the most important person in the most dangerous world on Earth. The wheels of the private jet touched down on the tarmac with a muffled thud that barely disturbed the deep, heavy sleep of baby Diyun. Tasha Brenda felt the shift in pressure in her ears and the sudden, sharp realization that the sanctuary of the cabin was dissolving. For the last several hours, high above the clouds, she had existed in a vacuum of strange, quiet intimacy with the man across the aisle. But as the plane taxied toward a secluded hangar far from the main terminal, the world of Shin Kyungmi began to reassert itself with a cold, mechanical efficiency. The shadows that had been held at bay by the cabin lights now seemed to lengthen, stretching out from the dark-tinted windows of the waiting motorcade. Tasha looked down at the infant cradled against her chest, feeling the soft, rhythmic puff of the child's breath against her skin, and felt a sudden, icy shiver. She was no longer just a passenger who had offered a moment of kindness, she was a witness who was being pulled into the gravity of a star that burned with a very dangerous light. Kyungmi stood up the moment the engines began their low, whining descent into silence. The vulnerability that had softened his features in the nursery-like quiet of the flight was gone, replaced instantly by the rigid, impenetrable mask of the syndicate sovereign. He didn't speak as he adjusted his jacket, his movements sharp and predatory. His enforcer, the man who had nearly drawn a weapon on Tasha hours ago, was already at the door, his hand on the latch, his eyes scanning the horizon of the airfield with a restless, violent hunger. When Kyungmi finally looked at Tasha, his gaze was no longer just appreciative, it was possessive. It was the look of a man who had found something precious and had already decided that the walls of his kingdom were the only place safe enough to house it. He reached out, his large hand hovering near Daeyeon's head, but he didn't take the child. Instead, he simply gestured for Tasha to follow him. The air outside was crisp, smelling of salt and aviation fuel, but as they were ushered into the back of a black, armored limousine, the scent changed to expensive leather and filtered air. Tasha sat in the plush darkness, the door closing with a heavy, pressurized thud that sounded like a tomb sealing shut. Kyungmi sat opposite her, his silhouette framed by the passing lights of the private airfield. They drove in a silence that was far more oppressive than the one on the plane. As the motorcade transitioned from the airport to the winding, coastal roads that climbed into the hills, Tasha saw the first true signs of Kyungmi's world. They didn't pass through ordinary neighborhoods. They passed through a series of checkpoints, each manned by men in dark suits who bowed low as the lead car approached. These weren't security guards, they were soldiers, their loyalty etched into their stiff postures and the way they avoided looking directly at the windows of the car. The Shin estate finally appeared through the mist like a fortress of glass and obsidian, perched on the edge of a jagged cliff that overlooked the churning black waters of the Pacific. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture infused with traditional Korean aesthetics, curved rooflines that mimicked the wings of a crane, but built from steel and reinforced concrete. As the gates groaned open, Tasha saw the sheer scale of the compound. The gardens were pristine, illuminated by hidden lights that made the manicured trees look like ghost-white sculptures. But beneath the beauty was a lethal infrastructure. She saw the glint of camera lenses hidden in the stone lanterns, the subtle movement of men on the perimeter walls, and the way the entire house seemed designed to be both a palace and a bunker. This was the estate of shadows, a place where the sun might shine, but the darkness of the underworld was woven into the very foundations. When the car stopped at the main entrance, a dozen men moved in a synchronized dance of protection, forming a corridor from the vehicle to the massive oak doors. Kyungmi stepped out first, his presence commanding the space with an effortless, terrifying authority. He reached back and offered a hand to Tasha. As she took it, her fingers disappearing into his large, warm grip, she felt the weight of his power pressing down on her. She stepped onto the stone driveway, clutching Daeyeon tightly, and felt the eyes of every man present on her. They didn't look at her with curiosity, they looked at her as if she were a ghost, a sudden and impossible anomaly in their sterile, violent world. A black woman carrying the heir of the Shin bloodline was a sight that defied every protocol they had ever been taught, yet the fact that she walked beside the dragon kept their tongues silent and their heads bowed. Inside, the foyer was a cathedral of silence and marble. A man in a high-collared charcoal suit, his hair stark white and combed back with military precision, stepped forward. This was Minso, the house manager, a man whose eyes held the cold wisdom of 3 generations of service to the Shin family. He bowed deeply to Kyungmi, then turned his gaze toward Tasha. For a moment, his professional mask faltered, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the infant sleeping peacefully in Tasha's arms. He looked at the way Tasha's simple gray shirt was wrinkled from the flight, the way her hair was escaping her ponytail, and the way she stood her ground despite the overwhelming opulence of the hall. He looked at Kyungmi, a silent question hanging in the air, but the boss only gave a sharp, definitive nod. "Prepare the south wing," Kyungmi commanded, his voice echoing off the marble walls like a tolling bell. "Everything she needs. Everything the child needs. And Minso, double the perimeter shift. No one enters this house without my personal clearance. Not the council, not the uncles. No one." Minso bowed again, though his voice was laced with a subtle, urgent concern. "Sir, the Park family is already asking questions about the delay at the airport. They are restless. Bringing an outsider into the heart of the estate, it violates the inner sanctum protocols. The council will see this as a sign of instability." Hyungmi took a step toward the older man, his shadow falling over him like a shroud. "I do not care what the council sees. I care what I see. And I see my daughter finally sleeping. If the Parks want to discuss stability, they can discuss it with the barrels of our rifles. Do as I said." Tasha watched the exchange, her heart hammering against her ribs. The reality of her situation was finally beginning to crystallize. She wasn't a guest, she was a protected asset in the middle of a Cold War. As Minso led them toward the south wing, Tasha walked through hallways lined with ancient Korean art, vases that were older than the country she was born in, paintings of mountains and spirits that seemed to watch her pass. But between the artifacts were the realities of Kyungmi's life. She passed a room where the door was slightly ajar, catching a glimpse of a dozen monitors displaying every angle of the estate, manned by men with headsets and sidearms. She saw the way the light glinted off the polished floor, reflecting the weapons of the guards stationed at every junction. Every step deeper into the house felt like a step further away from the life she knew. They reached a set of double doors that opened into a nursery that was more a sanctuary than a room. It was filled with soft, cream-colored fabrics and furniture made from hand-carved wood that smelled of cedar and lavender. A floor-to-ceiling window looked out over the cliffside, the moon reflecting off the ocean in a silver path that led to nowhere. It was beautiful, but to Tasha, it felt like a gilded cage. She walked to the center of the room and carefully laid Dayun down in a crib that looked like it belonged in a museum. The baby stirred for a second, a small, soft whimper escaping her lips, and Tasha froze, her hand resting on the child's chest until the breathing leveled out again. She turned to find Kyungmi standing in the doorway. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the full extent of the dragons on his forearms. He looked out of place in the softness of the nursery, a predator in a place of peace. He watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "You are safe here," he said, though the words sounded more like a decree than a reassurance. "My men are the best in the world. Nothing will touch you or the child within these walls." "Safe isn't the same as free, Mr. Shin," Tasha said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made him narrow his eyes. She walked toward the window, looking out at the dark horizon. "I saw the men at the gates. I saw the way your manager looked at me. I'm a nurse from a world where we heal people. Your world looks like it's built on how many people you can keep away." Hyungmi walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He stopped just behind her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "My world is built on survival," he rasped. "And right now, you are the only reason my daughter is surviving. That makes you the most important person in this house. More important than my captains, more important than my own life." He reached out, his hand coming to rest on the window frame next to hers, effectively surrounding her. "The Parks are vultures. They smell blood because I am grieving. They think my daughter is a weakness they can exploit. They don't understand that she is the only thing I have left to fight for." Tasha turned to face him, her back against the glass. The distance between them was negligible, a dangerous proximity that hummed with an unspoken tension. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the grief that he tried so hard to bury beneath his lethal reputation. For a moment, the mafia boss was gone, and there was only the man who had lost his wife and was terrified of losing his child. "I came because she was crying," Tasha whispered. "But I can't stay in a place where I have to look over my shoulder every time I walk down a hallway." "You won't have to look," Kyungmi said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate vibration. "Because I will be looking for you." You gave her the intimate gift. In my culture, that creates a bond of blood. You are no longer an outsider, Tasha. Whether you realize it or not, you are part of the Shin family now. And I protect my family with everything I am. As if to punctuate his words, a distant, muffled sound echoed through the estate, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a perimeter sensor being triggered, followed by the low, urgent barking of orders over a radio in the distance. Kyungmi's entire demeanor shifted in a heartbeat. His eyes went cold, his posture tensed, and the dragon tattoos on his arms seemed to pulse with a dark energy. He didn't even look at the door before he was moving toward it, his hand already reaching for a concealed phone in his pocket. He stopped at the threshold, looking back at Tasha one last time. The nursery, once a place of soft light and lavender, was suddenly cast in the harsh, red glow of an emergency alarm system. "Stay with the child," he commanded, his voice no longer that of a father, but of a general. "Do not leave this room until I return." He vanished into the shadows of the hallway, leaving Tasha alone in the silent, red-tinted room. She looked at the sleeping baby, then at the massive glass window that now felt like a target. The estate of shadows had revealed its true face. It was a place of breathtaking beauty and absolute, uncompromising violence, and Tasha Brenda, a woman who had only wanted to stop a child from crying, was now trapped in the heart of the storm. She sat down on the edge of the rocking chair, her eyes fixed on the door, realizing that the unthinkable act she had performed on the plane was only the beginning of a journey into a darkness she might never escape. The silence of the house returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, the heavy, expectant quiet of a predator waiting in the long shadows of the night. The crimson glare of the emergency lights eventually faded, replaced by the cool, moonlight-mimicking glow of the estate's standard night mode, but the air in the nursery remained thick with the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Tasha sat in the velvet-lined rocking chair, her movements rhythmic and mechanical, as if she could keep the world's violence at bay through the sheer force of her composure. Baby Dayun was a dead weight of peaceful innocence in her lap, oblivious to the fact that her father was currently prowling the perimeter like a god of war. The door to the nursery creaked open with a soft, agonizing slowness that made Tasha's breath hitch in her throat. She expected Kyungmi, smelling of the night air and cold fury, but instead, it was the elder house manager, Minso, who stepped into the room. He had replaced his charcoal suit jacket with a traditional silk waistcoat, and in his hand, he carried a tray of porcelain tea service that looked far too fragile for a house currently under siege. He didn't speak at first, moving with a ghost-like grace to a low table near the window. He poured the tea, the steam rising in delicate, swirling patterns that seemed to mimic the dragons etched into the walls of the estate. Only when he had finished did he turn his gaze to Tasha, and for the first time, his eyes weren't just cold, they were heavy with a solemnity that bordered on mourning. He gestured for her to join him, and though Tasha wanted to stay anchored to the safety of the rocking chair, she found herself standing, moving toward the old man with the slow, cautious steps of someone walking onto thin ice. She sat across from him, the sleeping child still cradled in her left arm, while her right hand reached for the warm cup he offered. The tea was bitter and complex, tasting of earth and ancient roots, a flavor that felt like a warning in itself. "The disturbance has been neutralized," Minso said, his voice a low, dry rasp that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "A scouting party from the Park family testing the strength of our new gates. They are gone now, but the wind they have stirred will not settle so easily." He paused, his eyes dropping to the baby's face, then back to Tasha's mahogany skin. "You are an anomaly, Miss Brenda. In 30 years of serving the Shin line, I have seen many things, betrayals that would freeze your blood, alliances forged in bone, and wealth that could buy small nations. But I have never seen an outsider touch the bloodline in the way you have. You think you performed a simple act of mercy on that plane. You think you were just a nurse answering a cry. But in this house, in the culture of the people who built this empire, there is no such thing as a simple act. Tasha gripped the porcelain cup, its warmth the only thing keeping her from trembling. I saw a baby who was suffering, Minso. That's all. I don't care about your empires or your bloodlines. I just wanted her to be okay. Minso leaned forward, the shadows of the room deepening the lines on his face. Intent does not matter to the spirits of the ancestors, nor does it matter to the men who represent them. When you gave the intimate gift to Diyun, when you shared your life force to sustain the Shin heir, you performed what we call the Sangmayang Ui Jiryu, the flow of life. It is an ancient, sacred concept that predates the syndicates and the laws of modern men. By nursing her, you have essentially woven your soul into the tapestry of this family. You are no longer a stranger who happened to be on a flight. You are now a sacred outsider. You are the vessel that kept the flame from flickering out, and because of that, you are bound to us. Bound? Tasha's voice was a sharp whisper, her heart beginning to drum a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I have a life. I have a home. I'm not some piece of property you can just claim because I did the right thing. Property? No, Minso said, shaking his head slowly. To Kyungmi, you are far more dangerous than property. You are a debt. And in the Korean underworld, a debt of life is the only thing that cannot be settled with money or blood. It can only be settled with presence. By saving his daughter, you have inadvertently stripped him of his invulnerability. Every man in the syndicate now knows that his heart is no longer made of stone, it is held in your hands. That is the price of your kindness, Miss Brenda. You have traded your anonymity for a crown of thorns. The rival families, like the Parks, no longer see you as a woman. They see you as the Shin family's greatest vulnerability. To touch you is to destroy Kyungmi. To kill you is to end the Shin line. Tasha looked down at Diyun, the child's small, perfect face now appearing like a heavy anchor dragging her into the depths. The weight of the house, the guards, the cameras, and the violent history of the man in the black suit suddenly felt suffocating. She realized that the intimate gift wasn't just a gift to the baby, it was a cage she had built for herself. He told me I was safe here, she said, though the words felt hollow. You are safe from the world, perhaps, Minso replied, his gaze unblinking. But who will save you from the weight of being a symbol? Kyungmi is a man of tradition, even as he breaks the world to suit his needs. He believes that the gods sent you to that plane. He believes that your milk is the only thing that can keep the darkness of the family legacy from consuming that child. He will not let you leave, not because he wishes to be cruel, but because he cannot fathom a world where the savior of his daughter is not within his reach. You have become the heart of the fortress, and a fortress does not let its heart walk away into the night. Tasha felt a tear prick the corner of her eye, the bitter tea turning to ash in her mouth. She thought of her quiet apartment, the life she had tried to rebuild after her own loss, the simple freedom of being nobody to everyone. All of it felt like a dream she was waking up from. She looked at Minso, seeing not just a house manager, but a sentinel of a system that didn't care for her individual soul. What happens if I try to go? If I just walk out those gates? Minso's expression softened into something that looked like pity, but it was the cold, distant pity of an executioner. The gates would open for you, but the world outside would be a gauntlet of shadows. The Parks would find you before you reached the city limits. They would use you to draw Kyungmi out. They would tear you apart just to see him bleed. Kyungmi knows this. His protection is not a gesture of love yet, Miss Brenda, it is a tactical necessity. You are the most valuable asset he has ever possessed. The price of your kindness is that you are now the target for every enemy he has made in 20 years of bloodshed. You are the sacred outsider, the woman who did the unthinkable, and now the unthinkable will follow you for the rest of your days. Tasha stood up, her knees weak, her arms tightening around the sleeping child as if she could shield the girl from the very words Minso was speaking. She walked back to the rocking chair, her shadow long and distorted on the marble floor. She felt the lethal nature of the estate closing in, the way the walls seemed to breathe with the secrets of the men who lived within them. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She wasn't just Tasha Brenda. She was a piece of a violent puzzle, a thread in a tapestry of silk and steel. As she sat back down, the door opened again, and this time it was Kyungmi. He stood in the entryway, his white shirt stained with a spray of dark fluid that might have been oil or blood, his eyes burning with a dark, restless energy. He looked at Minso, then at Tasha, his gaze lingering on the way she held his daughter. He didn't ask what they had discussed, he didn't need to. He could see the realization in the set of Tasha's shoulders, the way she looked at him with a mixture of fear and a new, terrible understanding. Minso, Kyungmi said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. Leave us. The old man bowed and gathered the tea service, disappearing into the shadows with the same ghost-like efficiency as before. Kyungmi walked into the room, stopping a few feet from Tasha. The scent of wood smoke and adrenaline clung to him, a stark reminder of the world outside the nursery windows. He looked down at Tasha, his large hands twitching at his sides as if he wanted to reach for her but didn't know how to touch something so fragile and so vital. He told you, Kyungmi stated. It wasn't a question. He told me I'm a prisoner, Tasha said, her voice trembling but her eyes remaining locked on his. He told me that because I helped your daughter, I've lost my life. Kyungmi took a step closer, his presence overwhelming the small space between them. He knelt down, his eyes level with hers, the dragons on his neck appearing vivid and menacing in the soft light. You haven't lost your life, Tasha. You found a new one. A life where you will never want for anything. A life where you are the most protected woman on this earth. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing the back of her hand, his touch surprisingly soft despite the violence she knew he was capable of. I cannot change the traditions of my people, and I cannot change the fact that my enemies are monsters. But I can promise you this, as long as I draw breath, no one will lay a finger on you. You saved my daughter's soul. Now, let me save your future. Tasha looked at him, at the mafia boss, the grieving husband, the desperate father, and she saw the cage he was offering her. It was made of gold and guarded by 1,000 men, but it was still a cage. She looked at Dayun, who stirred in her sleep, reaching out a tiny hand to grasp Tasha's shirt. The weight of the sacrifice she had made on that plane finally settled over her, a heavy, permanent mantle. She realized that Minso was right. The price of her kindness was everything she had been, but as she looked at the man kneeling before her, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Not just gratitude, but a profound, terrifying need. She was the sacred outsider, the heart of the fortress, and as the moon set over the Pacific, she began to realize that the dragon wasn't just protecting her from the world, he was looking to her to protect him from himself. The silence of the nursery returned, no longer peaceful, but charged with the heavy, inevitable gravity of a destiny that had been sealed with a single drop of milk and a stranger's mercy. She leaned her head back against the chair, closing her eyes as the reality of her new, dangerous life began to sink into her soul, the first-class flight feeling like a lifetime ago. The days that followed the arrival at the estate blurred into a strange, rhythmic suspension of reality, a domestic masquerade played out against a backdrop of high-tech surveillance and whispered threats. Tasha stayed confined to the nursery wing, a space that had become her entire universe, a world of soft pastels, expensive lotions, and the heavy, sweet scent of a healthy infant. Dayun was thriving, her cries now replaced by curious coos and a growing alertness that seemed to mirror Tasha's own heightened senses. Outside the heavy oak doors, the syndicate breathed with a restless, violent energy, but inside, the air was still, held in place by the fragile peace Tasha had brought with her. She had become a ghost in a palace of shadows, moving between the crib and the rocking chair, her only companions the silent guards at the end of the hall and the occasional, somber visits from Minso. Kyungmi was a phantom, a presence she felt more than she saw, the distant sound of a car engine late at night, the heavy tread of boots in the hallway, the lingering scent of sandalwood and gunpowder that told her he had stood outside her door while she slept. It was on the fourth night, when the moon was a sharp, silver hook in the black sky, that the silence of the nursery was broken. Tasha was sitting in the low light of a single lamp, Diane resting against her shoulder in the peaceful aftermath of a feeding. The door opened, not with the mechanical efficiency of the guards, but with a slow, almost hesitant click. Shin Kyungmi stepped into the room, looking more frayed than Tasha had ever seen him. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, the top buttons of his black shirt undone, and his hair, usually so meticulously styled, was ruffled as if he had been running his hands through it in frustration. He didn't look like a boss, he looked like a man who was losing a war with himself. He stopped by the door, his eyes immediately finding Tasha and the child, his expression softening into a look of such profound longing that Tasha felt a pang of unexpected empathy in her chest. He walked toward them, his movements devoid of their usual predatory grace. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on his daughter's sleeping face. "She looks like her," he whispered, his voice a low rasp that barely carried across the room. It was the first time he had mentioned his late wife since the flight. Miji had that same way of tilting her head in her sleep. Like she was listening to a conversation in a dream. I used to watch her for hours, wondering what she was hearing. He sat down on the edge of the ottoman, his large frame appearing diminished in the soft light of the nursery. "Now, when I look at Diane, I feel like I am looking at a ghost. A beautiful, living ghost that I don't know how to protect from the life I have made." Tasha shifted slightly, the baby's weight of familiar comfort. "You protect her by being here, Kyungmi. Not just by building walls, but by being the man she sees when she opens her eyes." She looked at him, seeing the way his hands were trembling slightly against his knees. "Minso told me about the price of my being here. He told me about the traditions and the danger. But he didn't tell me about the weight you're carrying. You're trying to be a king and a father at the same time, and those two men are at war, aren't they?" Kyungmi looked up, his dark eyes shimmering with an unshed vulnerability that made Tasha's breath hitch. "The king is all I have known since I was a boy. My father taught me that love is a luxury the Shin family cannot afford. He said that a heart is just a target you give your enemies." I believed him. Until the day Diane was born, and Miji was gone. In that one moment, I became the most powerful man in this city and the most helpless man in the world. He reached out, his finger tentatively touching the hem of the baby's blanket. "I am surrounded by men who would die for me, Tasha, but I am entirely alone. Except for when I am in this room. With you." The honesty of the admission hung in the air, heavy and shimmering. Tasha felt the walls she had built around her own heart, the walls made of grief for her lost son and the fear of this dangerous world, begin to crumble. She saw the man beneath the ink, the man who was just as broken by loss as she was. "I lost someone too," she said softly, her voice steady despite the sudden moisture in her eyes. "My son, Franklin. 8 months ago. SIDS. 1 minute he was breathing, and the next, the world was just silent. I spent months in that silence, Kyungmi. I thought my heart had turned to stone. I thought I would never have anything left to give a child again." She looked down at Diane, then back at him. "When I heard her crying on that plane, it wasn't a nurse's instinct that moved me. It was a mother's hunger. I needed to save her so I could feel like I wasn't still failing him." Kyungmi stood up and moved to the chair, kneeling beside it just as he had on the night they arrived. He took Tasha's free hand in his grip firm but incredibly gentle. "You didn't fail him, Tasha. And you aren't failing her. You are the only light in this house. Without you, Diane would be a princess in a tomb. And I would be a monster with nothing left to hold on to." He leaned his forehead against her knee, a gesture of such total surrender that it took Tasha's breath away. "I need you. Not just for her. I need the way you look at me without fear. I need the way you remind me that there is a world outside of blood and debt." Tasha reached out with her free hand, her fingers trembling as they brushed the hair back from his forehead. She felt the warmth of his skin, the frantic pulse in his temple. In that moment, the power dynamics of the syndicate and the racial barriers of their world ceased to exist. They were just two grieving souls finding a desperate, beautiful anchor in one another. "Then show me," she whispered. "Show her. Don't just be the dragon. Be her father. Sing to her, Kyungmi. Let her hear your voice when it isn't giving orders." Kyungmi looked up, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "I don't know any songs for children, Tasha. My father sang of battle and honor." Miji, she was the one who knew the melodies. "Then I'll teach you," Tasha said. She began to hum a low, soulful tune, a melody her grandmother had sung in the South, a song of hope and endurance. It was a lullaby that transcended language, a rhythmic heartbeat of sound. Kyungmi listened, his eyes locked on hers, and slowly, he began to join in. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, unfamiliar with the cadence of a lullaby, but as he followed Tasha's lead, the song transformed. It became a fusion of two worlds, the soulful ache of Tasha's heritage and the ancient, melodic sorrow of Kyungmi's. They sang together in the dim light, their voices intertwining, creating a canopy of sound that seemed to shield the nursery from the cameras and the guards. Daeyeon stirred, a small sigh escaping her lips, her tiny hand reaching out to grasp Kyungmi's thumb. As his daughter's fingers closed around his, Kyungmi's voice faltered, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. He didn't look away. He didn't hide his weakness. He leaned in, his face inches from Tasha's, the air between them thick with the realization of a mutual, desperate need. "Tasha," he breathed, her name sounding like a prayer. Tasha didn't pull away. She saw the man who was willing to be unmade for her, the man who was offering her a place in a world that was terrifying but also, for the first time in months, felt like home. She realized that she wasn't just the sacred outsider anymore. She was the woman who had found a reason to live in the heart of a fortress. She leaned forward, the distance closing with an inevitable, magnetic pull. When their lips finally met, it wasn't the tentative kiss of strangers, it was the desperate, soul-deep collision of two people who had been drowning and had finally found a hand to pull them up. It tasted of salt and longing, of sandalwood and the soft, sweet scent of the baby between them. The kiss was a seal, a promise made in the dark that neither of them could take back. It was the moment the one-week contract became a lifetime commitment, the moment the nurse and the boss became something else entirely. Kyungmi pulled back just an inch, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away her own tears. "I will change this world for you," he promised, his voice thick with a new kind of steel, not the kind that crushed enemies, but the kind that built futures. "I will tear it down piece by piece if it means you and Daeyeon never have to look back." Tasha leaned her forehead against his, her eyes closed, listening to the twin heartbeats of the man and the child. The lullaby had ended, but the music was still there, a soft, persistent hum in the marrow of her bones. She knew the Parks were still out there. She knew the council would see this as a betrayal of their bloodlines. She knew the peace of the nursery was an illusion that would soon be shattered by the reality of Kyungmi's life. But as he held her there, in the quiet heart of the estate of shadows, Tasha Brenda finally stopped feeling like an outsider. She felt like a woman who had been found. They stayed that way for a long time, three broken pieces forming a temporary, perfect whole. The intimate gift had led to an intimate realization, they were no longer just survival partners in a high-stakes game. They were a family, forged in the most unthinkable way, in the most dangerous place on earth. As the moon finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the room in a gentle, pre-dawn gray, Kyungmi stood up and gently took the sleeping Daeyeon from Tasha's arms. He laid her in the crib with a grace he hadn't possessed days before, then turned back to Tasha, offering his hand. "The sun is coming up," he said softly. "And the world will be waiting. But tonight, for just a few hours, we were just us." Tasha took his hand, her fingers interlocking with his, and as they walked toward the door, she realized that the price of her kindness wasn't just the danger or the debt. It was the beautiful, terrifying burden of being loved by a man who had nothing else to lose. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving the nursery in peace, while outside, the first light of morning touched the steel and glass of the estate, illuminating the dragons on the walls and the shadows that were already gathering for the storm that was to come. They walked together through the silent hallway, the sacred outsider and the dragon, two souls finally in sync, ready to face the unthinkable, as long as they didn't have to face it alone. The fragile peace of the nursery, so painstakingly built on the echoes of a shared lullaby and the warmth of a desperate kiss, did not merely break, it was obliterated. The transition from the soft, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping child to the jarring roar of high explosives was instantaneous, a violent tearing of the atmosphere that seemed to pull the very oxygen from the room. Tasha was thrown from her chair by the sheer concussive force of the first blast, her body instinctively curling around Diane as they tumbled onto the thick, cream-colored carpet. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows, reinforced with layers of polycarbonate and tempered steel, groaned under the pressure wave but held, though the silver reflection of the moon was replaced by the flickering, demonic orange of a massive fire rising from the lower gardens. The distraction had begun, a calculated, thunderous opening act designed to draw the dragon's fire away from the throat of the estate. Tasha scrambled to her knees, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the immediate aftermath of the explosion. Diane, startled from her deep sleep, let out a thin, terrified shriek that pierced through the sensory fog, and Tasha clutched the infant to her chest with a strength born of pure, primal adrenaline. The red emergency lights did not flicker this time, they remained steady and baleful, casting the room in the color of fresh blood. Outside the door, the silent hallway exploded into a cacophony of tactical commands and the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots. The syndicate was no longer a shadow, it was a machine of war, awakening with a lethal precision that sent a cold shiver down Tasha's spine. She could hear the distinctive, rapid-fire chatter of automatic weapons echoing from the courtyard below, a sound like 1,000 hammers striking iron in a desperate, deadly rhythm. The door to the nursery burst open, and for a terrifying second, Tasha expected to see a monster. Instead, it was Kyungmi. He looked like a nightmare manifested, a far cry from the man who had wept against her hours before. He was wearing a tactical vest over his black shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dragons on his arms, which seemed to pulse in the flickering firelight. In his hand was a heavy, matte black handgun, held with a familiarity that was as natural to him as breathing. His eyes were no longer those of a father, they were the cold, calculating voids of a man who had seen the end of the world and decided to survive it. Behind him, 3 men in full tactical gear fanned out, their weapons pointed toward the door, their movements synchronized and silent. "Get up," Kyungmi commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl that cut through the ringing in Tasha's ears. He was across the room in 2 strides, his hand reaching out to pull her to her feet with a force that was both protective and frantic. He didn't look at her face, his eyes were constantly scanning the windows, the vents, the shadows. The parks have breached the outer perimeter. The first blast was a distraction meant for the armory, but they have men in the tunnels. We have 5 minutes to get you to the safe room before this sector is overrun. Kyungmi, what's happening? Tasha gasped, her voice trembling as she struggled to keep her footing. The baby, she's terrified. I know, he snapped, though he reached out and placed a single, blood-stained hand on Diane's head for a fleeting second, a gesture of doomed tenderness. They're not here for territory anymore, Tasha. They're here for the debt. They think by taking you and the child, they can break my back. They are wrong. He turned to his lead enforcer, a man named Juan who looked like he had been forged in the same fire as the boss. Secure the hallway. If anything moves that doesn't have a Shin tattoo, kill it. Use the incendiaries if you have to. I want this wing scorched if they take it. Tasha recoiled at the cold-blooded efficiency of his orders, but there was no time for moral reckoning. Kyungmi gripped her arm, guiding her toward the back of the nursery where a seemingly solid wall of hand-carved cedar waited. He pressed his palm against a hidden sensor, and with a hiss of hydraulics, the wood slid back to reveal a narrow, dimly lit staircase that led into the bowels of the cliffside. As they stepped into the darkness, a second explosion rocked the estate, much closer this time. The ceiling of the nursery groaned, and a fine dust of plaster began to fall like gray snow. The scream of a man echoed from the hallway, followed by a wet, gurgling silence that told Tasha the war had reached the inner sanctum. The descent was a blur of shadows and the smell of old stone and cold grease. Kyungmi led the way, his weapon leading every turn, his body a shield between Tasha and the unknown. Below them, the estate was a labyrinth of secrets, tunnels carved by the original Shin patriarchs for moments exactly like this. But even here, the sounds of the battle followed them. The vibration of grenades detonating against the foundations felt like a series of small earthquakes, shaking the very earth around them. Tasha held Dayun so tightly her arms began to ache, whispering nonsense words of comfort into the child's ear, trying to drown out the sounds of men dying just a few dozen feet above their heads. Almost there, Kyungmi whispered, his voice echoing in the stone throat of the staircase. The safe room is deep earth. It has its own oxygen, its own power. Even if the house falls, you will be safe. But the house was not falling, it was being torn apart. As they reached the bottom of the stairs, a heavy steel door blocked their path. Kyungmi moved to the keypad, his fingers flying across the buttons, but before he could finish the sequence, the wall to their left exploded in a shower of concrete and rebar. The Parks had used a shaped charge to breach the tunnel from the utility access point. The force of the blast threw Kyungmi against the opposite wall and sent Tasha sprawling onto the cold floor. Through the dust and the smoke, 3 figures appeared, wearing tactical masks and bearing the insignia of the Park faction, a stylized viper coiling around a broken sword. Kyungmi was on his feet before the dust had even settled, his weapon barked twice, the muzzle flashes illuminating the tunnel in strobe-like bursts. 2 of the attackers went down, but the third leveled an assault rifle at Tasha. In that heartbeat, the world slowed to a crawl. Tasha saw the barrel of the gun, saw the finger tightening on the trigger, and knew that the intimate gift was about to end in a spray of red on stone. But Kyungmi did not hesitate. He threw his own body into the line of fire, his shoulder taking the impact of the round as he tackled the gunman into the darkness of the breached wall. The sound of the struggle was a chaotic mess of grunts, the thud of flesh on stone, and the sickening snap of bone. Tasha scrambled backward, her eyes wide with a terror she had never known. She saw Kyungmi emerge from the smoke, his shirt torn, blood soaking into the black fabric of his shoulder, but his eyes were still burning with that same, unyielding fire. He didn't look at his wound, he looked at Tasha. He looked at Dayun. "Get in," he hissed, grabbing her by the waist and shoving her toward the steel door, which was finally sliding open. "Now, Tasha. Go." "You're hurt," she cried, reaching for him, her fingers catching the wet warmth of his blood. "Come with us, Kyungmi. You can't stay out here." "I have to hold the tunnel," he said, his voice a jagged rasp of pain and authority. "If I go in, they'll just set a thermite charge on the door and cook us all. I have to drive them back to the courtyard." He looked at her then, a look of such absolute, terrifying love that it broke Tasha's heart more than any bullet could. "Stay in the room. Don't open the door for anyone but me or Minso. Do you understand? No one." He shoved her inside the vault-like room, a space of sterile white lights and rows of monitors. Before she could protest again, the heavy steel door began to hiss shut. The last thing Tasha saw before the seal was complete was Shin Kyungmi standing in the middle of the smoking tunnel, a lone dragon guarding the entrance to his heart, his weapon raised as more shadows began to pour through the breach. Then, there was only the sound of the heavy bolts sliding into place, and the sudden, deafening silence of the safe room. Tasha collapsed onto a bench, her chest heaving, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped the baby. She looked at the monitors. The estate was a map of fire. She saw the gardens she had admired from the window being churned into mud by the boots of 100 men. She saw the dragon of the Shin Syndicate on one of the cameras, moving through the smoke of the lower hallway like a vengeful spirit, his black suit a smudge against the orange glare of the fires. He was fighting with a ferocity that was inhuman, a man who had traded his soul for a few more minutes of safety for the woman and child in the vault. But as she watched the screens, Tasha saw something that made her blood run cold. On a camera she hadn't noticed before, the one monitoring the deep-level ventilation shafts, a group of men in park colors were already bypass cutting the secondary seals. The distraction had worked too well. While Kyungmi was fighting like a god in the hallways, the Vipers were already inside the walls. The safe room was no longer a sanctuary, it was a trap. Tasha looked at the sleeping child, then at the heavy door that she couldn't open from the inside without the code Kyungmi hadn't given her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The war had not just come to the gates, it was in the room with her. The air in the vault suddenly felt thin, and the silence, which she had craved just moments ago, now felt like the weight of a tomb. She clutched Diane to her heart, her eyes fixed on the ventilation grate in the ceiling, waiting for the first shadow to drop from the darkness. The sacred outsider was alone in the dark, and for the first time, the dragon was too far away to hear her scream. The silence of the deep earth vault was not a sanctuary, but a vacuum that amplified the frantic, wet sound of Tasha's own breathing. On the bank of cold LED monitors, the world above was dissolving into an apocalyptic canvas of amber and charcoal. The estate of shadows was earning its name as the fires from the lower levels licked the reinforced glass of the upper balconies, turning the architectural masterpiece into a towering furnace. Tasha huddled in the corner of the room, her back pressed against the cold steel of the server rack, her arms a protective cage around baby Diane. The infant had finally fallen into a stunned, exhausted silence, her small face buried in the crook of Tasha's neck, a single tear drying on her cheek. Tasha's eyes were fixed on the ventilation grate in the ceiling, the metal slats appearing like the teeth of a predator in the dim, red emergency light. She waited for the sound of Kyungmi's voice, for the heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots that would signal their salvation, but the only sound was the distant, subterranean groan of the mountain settling under the weight of the explosions above. The first sign of the breach was not a sound, but a smell, the acrid, chemically sweet scent of industrial cutting foam. Tasha watched in paralyzed horror as a thick, white substance began to ooze from the edges of the heavy ventilation cover, sizzling as it ate through the secondary magnetic seals Kyungmi had promised were impenetrable. The Park family had not come to play by the rules of old-world honor, they had come with the tools of modern demolition. Within seconds, the grate didn't just open, it was kicked inward, clattering onto the marble floor with a sound that felt like a death knell. Tasha scrambled to her feet, her instinct to run warring with the reality that there was nowhere left to go. The vault was a dead end, a steel box buried 60 feet beneath the burning earth. A figure dropped from the shaft with the fluid, silent grace of a spider. He was dressed in matte black tactical gear, a Viper insignia glinting on his shoulder. Before Tasha could even scream, two more followed, their boots hitting the floor with a synchronized, heavy thud. They didn't point their weapons at her, they didn't need to. The predatory confidence in their movements told Tasha everything she needed to know about her own helplessness. The lead man, his face obscured by a dark ballistic mask, stepped toward her, his gloved hand reaching out not for her, but for the child. "Don't touch her." Tasha's voice was a raw, jagged edge in the small room. She backed away until her spine hit the reinforced steel of the main door, her grip on Diane tightening to a point that made the baby let out a sharp, frightened whimper. "If you hurt her, Kyungmi will burn every house your family owns. He will leave nothing but ash." The masked man stopped, a low, distorted chuckle vibrating from behind his respirator. "Kyungmi is currently bleeding out in a hallway 2 levels up, nurse. He's a dead man who hasn't stopped walking yet. And as for the ash, look at the screens. The Shin legacy is already burning. We aren't here to hurt the brat. She's the golden ticket. And you." He tilted his head, his eyes cold and dark behind the goggles. "You're the intimate gift we've heard so much about. The stain on the bloodline. Jinho wants to see what kind of woman makes a dragon forget his fire." Before Tasha could react, the man moved with a speed that blurred her vision. He didn't strike her, He simply applied a pressure point to her wrist that sent a bolt of white-hot agony up her arm, forcing her fingers to unfurl. She gasped, her knees buckling as the second man stepped in and wrenched Diane from her grasp. The separation was a physical wound, a tearing of her soul that left her breathless. Diane erupted into a scream of pure, primal terror, her tiny fists flailing against the tactical vest of the stranger. "No. Please." Tasha lunged forward, her fingers clawing at the black fabric of the man's suit, but a heavy hand slammed into her chest, pinning her against the wall. "Save your breath," the leader growled. "You're coming with us. We have a trade to make, and Jinho doesn't like to be kept waiting in the heat." They didn't lead her out through the main door. They dragged her toward the ventilation shaft, forcing her to climb a narrow, secondary ladder that felt like the throat of a beast. Tasha struggled, her mind a chaotic storm of grief and fury, but the cold barrel of a handgun pressed against her temple silenced her protests. Every time she heard Diane's muffled cries from the man climbing above her, her heart felt like it was being ground between stones. She had promised Kyungmi she would stay in the room. She had promised she would protect the child. And now, she was being led into the heart of the very fire they had tried to escape. When they finally emerged from the tunnel system, they weren't in the house. They were in the ruins of the West Conservatory, a place that had once been filled with rare orchids and the scent of jasmine. Now, it was a skeletal wreckage of twisted metal and shattered glass. The heat was a physical weight, the air thick with the smell of burning cedar and the ozone of discharged weapons. Tasha looked up and saw the main mansion, the great fortress Kyungmi had built, engulfed in a crown of fire. The curved rooflines were collapsing, sending showers of sparks into the night sky like dying stars. It was the end of an era, the literal cremation of a dynasty. Standing in the center of the blackened garden, surrounded by a dozen armed men, was a man who could only be Park Jinho. He was younger than Kyungmi, dressed in a sharp, light gray suit that looked obscenely clean against the backdrop of the destruction. He was holding a glass of amber liquid, watching the mansion burn with the detached fascination of an artist admiring his latest work. When he saw Tasha and the baby being dragged toward him, a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "So," Jinho said, his voice smooth and devoid of the gravelly honor that defined Kyungmi, the legendary savior. "The woman who traded her milk for the protection of a ghost." He walked toward her, stepping over the charred remains of a rosebush. He reached out and touched Tasha's chin, forcing her to look at him. "You're beautiful in a tragic sort of way. I can see why he's distracted. He's always had a weakness for things that are broken." Tasha spat at his feet, her eyes burning with a defiance that made Jinho's smile falter for a fraction of a second. "He's coming for you," she hissed. "You can burn his house, but you haven't killed the dragon. When he finds you, there won't be enough of you left to bury." Jinho laughed, a sharp, cold sound that was drowned out by the roar of a collapsing timber from the house. "He's already found us, Tasha. Or rather, he's trying to. He's currently trapped in the north courtyard, surrounded by 30 of my best men. He's fighting for a woman who is already gone and a child he will never hold again." He turned to the man holding Diane, who was now sobbing with a heartbreaking, rhythmic exhaustion. "Take them to the transport. We move to the docks. I want Kyungmi to see the lights of the ship as it leaves with everything he loves. I want him to know that he traded his empire for a few nights of comfort, and in the end, he lost it all anyway." Tasha was shoved toward a waiting black SUV, her feet dragging through the ash. She looked back at the burning estate, her heart screaming for the man who was somewhere in that inferno, fighting a hopeless battle for her. She saw the dragons on the walls being consumed by the flames, the ancient symbols of power turning to dust. The sacred outsider was being stolen away into the night, the weight of the intimate gift now a heavy chain around her neck. As the door of the SUV slammed shut, plunging her into darkness, the last thing she saw was the reflection of the fire in Jinho's eyes. The mansion was a funeral pyre, the nursery was gone, and the woman who had only wanted to heal a child was now the ultimate pawn in a game of blood and vengeance. The vehicle lurched forward, speeding away from the cliffside and toward the industrial darkness of the docks. Tasha sat in the back, her hands bound with plastic ties, her eyes fixed on the man holding Diane in the seat in front of her. She didn't cry. The time for tears had passed in the vault. As the smell of the burning estate faded, replaced by the salt spray of the ocean, a new kind of steel began to form in Tasha Brenda's soul. She wasn't just a nurse, and she wasn't just a victim. She was a mother who had already lost one child to the silence of the night, and she would be damned if she lost another to the greed of men like Jinho. She watched the back of the driver's head, her mind beginning to work with the same cold, tactical precision she had seen in Kyungmi. The dragon might be trapped in the fire, but his fire was now burning in her. The breach was complete, the mansion was lost, but the war for Diane's life was only just beginning. As the SUV roared into the night, Tasha leaned her head back and began to hum the lullaby they had shared, a soft, defiant sound that the men in the car couldn't understand, but one that she knew, somewhere in the darkness, Kyungmi would feel in his very bones. The sacred outsider was no longer waiting to be saved, she was preparing to fight. The black SUV tasted of stale air and the lingering metallic scent of the men who had stolen her, a claustrophobic contrast to the salt-heavy wind whipping against the chassis as they neared the industrial shipyards. Tasha sat in the back, her wrists bound by plastic ties that bit into her skin with every jolt of the vehicle, but her gaze remained fixed on the back of the driver's head with a predatory stillness. In her lap, Diane had finally succumbed to the exhaustion of terror, her small body twitching in a fitful sleep that was occasionally interrupted by a hitching, ragged breath. They were surrounded by the enemy, submerged in a world where her very existence was being framed as a crime, yet Tasha felt a cold, crystalline clarity settling over her. She was no longer just the woman from the plane, she was the keeper of the Shin Air, and she realized that the men in this car were more afraid of what she represented than they were of the weapons they carried. They were moving toward the docks, toward a confrontation that would decide the fate of two dynasties, and Tasha knew that her voice was the only thing that could bridge the gap between Kyungmi's survival and his total destruction. The vehicle slowed as it entered a perimeter of rusted shipping containers and towering cranes that looked like skeletal giants against the orange glow of the distant, burning estate. They stopped in the center of a wide, concrete pier where the air was thick with the smell of diesel and rotting kelp. Park Jinho stepped out of the lead car, his light gray suit looking ghostly in the harsh glare of the floodlights. He waited as Tasha was dragged from the SUV, his eyes scanning her with a mixture of disdain and strategic curiosity. He didn't see a human being, he saw a chemical imbalance in a carefully constructed formula of power. To Jinho, Tasha was the pollution, the variable that had allowed the dragon to be weakened, and he was eager to display her as a trophy of Kyungmi's supposed fall from grace. He gestured for his men to bring her forward, the rough grip on her arms a constant reminder that her value was strictly transactional in this theater of shadows and blood. Standing at the edge of the pier, overlooking the dark, churning water, were three older men dressed in traditional hanbok, their faces etched with the severe, unyielding lines of a century of rigid adherence to protocol. These were the elders of the council, the silent architects of the underworld's laws. They had been summoned to witness the desecration of the Shin bloodline, and as Tasha was shoved to her knees before them, she felt the weight of their judgment like a physical shroud. They didn't look at her with anger, but with a profound, clinical revulsion, as if she were a smudge on a sacred text. Jinho stood beside them, his voice smooth and laced with a theatrical sorrow that didn't reach his eyes. He began to speak in a rapid, formal Korean that Tasha couldn't translate, but the tone was unmistakable. He was presenting his evidence. He was showing them the woman who had nursed the air, the sacred outsider who had crossed a line that had remained uncrossed for 1,000 years. "Look at her," Jinho said, switching to English with a sneer, his eyes darting to the elders to ensure they understood the gravity of his performance. "This is the woman Kyungmi chose over the stability of our streets. This is the nurse who has been allowed into the inner sanctum of the Shin estate. He has allowed his daughter, the future of the most powerful syndicate on the coast, to be sustained by the milk of a stranger, a woman with no lineage, no history, no right to touch the blood of our fathers." He paced in front of Tasha, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete like the ticking of a clock. Kyungmi has not just failed as a leader, he has polluted the very essence of what we are. He has traded our sacred traditions for the comfort of a nurse's arms, and in doing so, he has forfeited his right to lead. The Shin line is no longer pure. It is broken, and it is his hand that held the hammer. The elders remained silent, their eyes fixed on Dian, who had woken up and was staring at the strangers with wide, confused eyes. One of the men, his white hair pulled back in a tight knot, stepped forward and spoke a single, sharp sentence in Korean. Jinho nodded eagerly. The elder asks if the rumors are true, Jinho translated, looking at Tasha with a cruel light in his eyes. Did you, a woman of the West, lay claim to the child's soul through the intimate gift? Did you dare to weave your common thread into the silk of a king? Tasha looked up, her jaw set, her mahogany skin glistening with the salt spray of the ocean. She didn't look at Jinho, she looked directly at the elder, meeting his gaze with an intensity that made the old man recoil ever so slightly. I didn't lay claim to anything, she said, her voice ringing out across the pier, steady and devoid of the fear Jinho expected. I saw a child who was starving for the warmth her father couldn't give her. I saw a baby who was dying in the middle of a first-class cabin while all of you and your traditions did nothing but watch. If your bloodline is so fragile that a mother's kindness can break it, then it wasn't worth protecting in the first place. Jinho lunged forward, his hand snapping out to strike her across the face, but the elder raised a hand, stopping him mid-motion. The old man looked at Tasha for a long time, his expression unreadable. He saw the fire in her eyes, the way she held the child not as a hostage, but as a mother protects her own. He saw the pollution Jinho spoke of, but he also saw something else, a strength that was older than his syndicates and more resilient than his laws. He turned back to Jinho and spoke again, his voice like the grinding of ancient stones. The elder says that the pollution is not in the milk, Jinho hissed, his face reddening with a sudden, violent frustration. He says the pollution is in the weakness that allowed the child to cry for so long. But it doesn't matter what he says. The council follows the law of the dragon, and the law says that any head of a family who allows an outsider into the sacred circle is subject to the right of removal. He leaned down, his face inches from Tasha's, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey and cold ambition. Kyungmi is coming. He is already at the gates of the shipyard. And when he arrives, he will find you here, standing before the council, as the ultimate proof of his failure. I will offer him an ultimatum, Tasha. He can renounce you and the child, allowing us to cleanse the line, or he can die here, on this pier, as a traitor to his ancestors. What do you think he will choose? The crown or the nurse? Tasha felt a cold dread pooling in her stomach, but she didn't let it show. She knew Kyungmi. She knew the man who had wept in the nursery, the man who had traded his suit for tactical gear to hold a tunnel for 5 more minutes. He's already made his choice, she whispered. He made it the moment he let me hold her. You think you're using me to destroy him, but you're just giving him a reason to burn the rest of the world down. The sound of a high-performance engine screaming into the shipyard cut through the night, followed by the screech of tires on concrete. A single black sedan tore through the perimeter of Jinho's men, crashing through a barricade of wooden crates before spinning to a halt 50 yards from the pier. The door flew open, and Shin Kyungmi stepped out. He was a vision of absolute, unmitigated destruction. His black shirt was shredded, his shoulder was soaked in blood that had turned the fabric into a stiff, dark armor, and his face was a mask of soot and fury. He didn't have a weapon in his hand, he didn't need one. The violence radiating from him was a physical force that made the men around Jinho shift uncomfortably, their fingers tightening on their triggers. Kyungmi walked toward the pier, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He didn't look at Jinho. He didn't look at the elders. His eyes were locked on Tasha and Dian, a look of such raw, agonizing relief passing over his features that Tasha felt her own heart break. He stopped 10 paces from the council, his chest heaving, the dragons on his neck appearing like living shadows in the floodlights. Let them go, Kyungmi said, his voice a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. "Not so fast, Kyungmi," Jinho shouted, stepping behind Tasha and placing a hand on her shoulder, his fingers digging into her skin. "The council is here. They have seen the woman. They have heard the story of the intimate gift. They are ready to pass judgment on the dragon who allowed his blood to be thinned by a stranger. You have a choice to make, brother. Renounce the child and the woman. Declare them a mistake, a temporary lapse in judgment, and hand them over to us for processing. Do this, and you can keep your title. You can remain the head of the Shin line, under the council's supervision." Jinho leaned in, his voice dripping with malice. "Or, you can stand with them. You can claim this pollution as your own, and die a common traitor on this pier. The elders are waiting. What is the word of the dragon?" Hyungmi looked at the elders, those three silent sentinels of a world he had spent his life serving. He saw the expectation in their eyes, the demand for a return to the cold, sterile purity of the past. Then he looked at Tasha. He saw the woman who had walked into the lion's den on a plane to save a child she didn't know. He saw the mother who had held his daughter in the middle of a war zone. He saw the only thing in his life that wasn't built on a lie. "You call her a pollution," Kyungmi said, his voice gaining a terrifying, melodic clarity. He turned back to the elders, his eyes burning with a light they had never seen in him. "You call her a stain on the bloodline because she isn't of our world. But you are wrong. She isn't a stain. She is the only thing that makes this bloodline worth continuing. She gave my daughter life when I was too weak to find it. She gave this family a heart when all we had was ice and iron." He stepped forward, his hand reaching out toward Tasha, his palm open and trembling. "I do not renounce her. I do not renounce my daughter. If being a dragon means living in a world without them, then the dragon is dead." He looked at Jinho, a smile of pure, lethal promise touching his lips. "You wanted an ultimatum, Jinho. Here is mine. You have 10 seconds to get your hand off her shoulder before I show the council exactly how much pollution is left in my veins." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the lapping of the water against the pier. The elders looked at one another, a silent communication passing between them. They saw a man who had found something more powerful than their laws. They saw the end of the old world and the beginning of something they couldn't control. Jinho's face twisted in rage, his hand tightening on Tasha, but before he could speak, the elder with the white hair stepped forward. He didn't look at Jinho. He looked at Kyungmi, and then he performed a gesture that silenced everyone on the pier. He bowed. Not to the boss, but to the father. He bowed to the man who had chosen love over power, and in that moment, Jinho's ultimatum crumbled into dust. The sacred outsider had not destroyed the bloodline, she had redefined it. And as Kyungmi took the final step toward her, his hand finally touching hers, Tasha realized that the war wasn't over, but the victory was already won. The dragon had found his fire, and it was a fire that would burn the old world to the ground to make room for the new. The salt-heavy air of the shipyard seemed to freeze in the lungs of every man present as the elders' bow signaled a seismic shift in the foundation of the underworld. The silence was no longer the heavy, expectant quiet of execution, but the stunned, hollowed-out stillness of a world that had just seen its axis tilt. Shin Kyungmi did not move for a long heartbeat, his hand still hovering in the open space between him and Tasha, his blood-soaked shirt a testament to the war he had waged just to stand on this concrete pier. He looked at the white-haired elder, then at the two men behind him, and finally at Park Jinho, whose face was a mask of twitching, incoherent rage. Jinho's grip on Tasha's shoulder had loosened, his fingers trembling with the realization that the pollution he had tried to weaponize had instead become a catalyst for a revolution he couldn't survive. The floodlights overhead buzzed with a low-frequency hum, the only sound accompanying the rhythmic lapping of the dark Pacific against the rusted pylons. The bow of a grandfather does not settle the debts of a king, Jinho finally spat, his voice cracking with a desperate, sharp edge. He stepped away from Tasha, retreating toward the line of his own men who stood with their weapons leveled, their eyes darting between their boss and the blood-streaked dragon. The council can bow until their backs break, but the law of the syndicate is written in ledgers, not in nursery rhymes. Hyungmi, you have burned your estate. You have allowed your soldiers to die in the tunnels. Your warehouses are ash, and your reputation is a smear on this pier. You think a bow buys you a life? You have nothing left to trade but the very breath in your lungs. Jinho gestured wildly toward the city skyline, where the distant glow of the fires still painted the clouds in a bruised purple. I own the docks now. I own the routes. I own the silence of the police. You are a man without a kingdom, standing here with a woman who belongs to no one. Hyungmi took a slow, deliberate breath, the dragons on his neck appearing to move as his chest expanded. He didn't look at Jinho. He looked at the three elders, his gaze steady and devoid of the pride that had once defined him. Jinho is right about one thing, Hyungmi said, his voice carrying a resonant, funereal weight that seemed to vibrate through the concrete beneath their feet. The ledgers must be balanced. A king who cannot protect his walls is no longer a king. And a father who values a crown over his child is a man who deserves to lose both. He reached into the inner pocket of his shredded tactical vest and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound case. It was small, no larger than a deck of cards, but the sight of it made the elder stiffen and Jinho's eyes widen in a mixture of greed and terror. Inside the case were three ancient, iron keys, their surfaces etched with the sigils of the founding Shin patriarchs. They weren't keys to a door, they were the keys to the city, the digital and physical access codes to the offshore accounts, the real estate deeds held in shadow corporations, and the encrypted communication nodes that controlled every illicit transaction from Vancouver to San Diego. They were the physical manifestation of the Shin Empire, a legacy built on a century of blood, sweat, and uncompromising ruthlessness. To hold these keys was to hold the heart of the West Coast underground. Hyungmi held them out, the iron glinting coldly under the floodlights, a stark contrast to the red blood staining his palms. Hyungmi, no, Tasha whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. She tried to stand, but her legs were still weak from the hours of terror. She looked at the man she had come to love, the man who was currently holding his entire life's work in his hand like a handful of common stones. She saw the sacrifice he was making, the great sacrifice that would strip him of his identity, his protection, and his past. He was surrendering his divinity to become a man. Hyungmi didn't look back at her, but the set of his shoulders told her he had hurt her. He stepped forward, stopping inches from the lead elder. I am the last of the Shin line to hold these, he said, his voice a low, melodic oath. They represent a century of power that has brought me nothing but a burning house and a hollow heart. I surrender them to the council. Not to Jinho. Not to the parks. To the council, to be held in trust or divided as you see fit. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he turned his head slightly toward Jinho. But there is a price for the keys. A price that is non-negotiable. The lead elder reached out, his weathered hand hovering over the iron keys, his eyes reflecting a deep, somber respect. Speak the price, Shin Kyungmi, the old man said, his voice a dry rustle of silk. The life of Tasha Brenda and the life of Shin De-yun, Kyungmi declared, each word falling like a hammer blow. They are to be declared sanctuary souls. Their names are to be removed from every ledger, every hit list, and every grudge. They are to be allowed to walk away from this pier, from this city, and from this life, with the full protection of the council. Anyone who follows them, anyone who whispers their names in malice, anyone who seeks to use them as leverage against me ever again, will face the combined wrath of every family represented by these keys. He looked back at Jinho, his expression one of absolute, terrifying finality. And as for me, I am to be declared dead. The dragon of the West Coast died in the fire at the estate. What stands before you now is a man with no name, no rank, and no debt. I trade the keys for our freedom. Take them, or I will drop them into the harbor and we can all watch the empire drown together. Jinho lunged forward, his face contorted. You can't do that. Those keys belong to the winner. I took your house. I took your streets. You took a pile of stones and a few miles of asphalt, Jinho, Kyungmi said, his voice dripping with a cold, refined contempt. You never took the empire. The empire is in these keys, and the keys are mine to give. And I choose to give them to the only people who still understand the value of a blood debt. He looked back at the elder. Do we have an accord? The elder looked at the keys, then at the burning horizon, and finally at Tasha, who was watching Kyungmi with a look of such profound, agonizing devotion that it seemed to illuminate the dark pier. The old man reached out and closed Kyungmi's fingers over the keys one last time, a silent gesture of farewell, before taking the leather case into his own hands. He tucked it into the sleeve of his hanbok and turned to the other elders, who nodded in solemn agreement. The dragon is dead, the elder announced, his voice carrying across the shipyard, amplified by the silence of the listening men. The debt is settled. The woman and the child are sanctuary. They belong to the wind now. And the man is a ghost. Let no one speak his name again. The men around Jinho began to lower their weapons, the authority of the council overriding the ambition of their temporary master. Jinho stood paralyzed, his empire evaporating before his eyes, replaced by a vacuum of power he didn't know how to fill. He had won the war, but he had lost the prize. He watched as Kyungmi turned away from the council and walked toward Tasha. The sacred outsider was no longer a pawn, she was the destination. Kyungmi knelt in the dirt and ash of the pier, his movements slow and pained. He reached out and finally took Dayun from the man who had been holding her, the guard stepping back as if burned by the sudden intensity of the father's presence. He tucked his daughter against his chest, her small head resting exactly where the dragons on his tactical vest were torn away. Then, he reached for Tasha. He used his teeth to pull the plastic ties from her wrists, his eyes never leaving hers. When her hands were finally free, she didn't rub her bruised skin, she reached out and cupped his face, her thumbs tracing the lines of soot and blood. You gave it all away, she whispered, a sob finally breaking through her composure. Your history, your name, everything. Do you ever regret it? He asked softly, a question they hadn't dared to voice in a long time. Leaving everything behind? Being a ghost in the middle of nowhere? Tasha shook her head, her hand coming to rest on her stomach, where a new life was just beginning to stir. They hadn't told anyone yet, not even Minso during his rare, encrypted check-ins. It was their newest secret, a promise of a future that was entirely their own. I don't regret a single second, she said. I would walk onto that plane and hear those screams 1,000 times over if it meant ending up here with you. We aren't ghosts, Elias. We're finally alive. He pulled her into a deep, lingering kiss that tasted of coffee and the salt-sweet air of the coast. It was a kiss of total transformation, a seal on their new life that felt more permanent than any syndicate contract. As they broke apart, the sound of a soft, waking coo drifted through the open door. Dayun was awake, her morning greeting a melodic sound that filled the house with life. Elias smiled, a genuine, effortless expression that reached his eyes, and took Tasha's hand, leading her back inside. The interior of the house was warm and filled with the evidence of their new reality. There were books on nursing and child development on the coffee table, a stack of firewood by the hearth, and a nursery filled with hand-carved wooden toys that Elias had spent his evenings crafting. In the center of the room, Dayun was pulling herself up against the railing of her playpen, her dark hair messy from sleep, her eyes lighting up as she saw her parents. Elias scooped her up, lifting her high into the air until she squealed with delight, her tiny hands reaching out to grab his ears. Good morning, my little dragon, Elias murmured, pressing his nose against hers. He looked at Tasha over the child's shoulder, a silent communication of absolute peace passing between them. They spent the morning in a slow, domestic rhythm that would have been unthinkable a year ago. They ate breakfast together at the wooden table Elias had built. The conversation focused on simple things, the garden Tasha wanted to plant in the spring, the repair needed on the porch steps, the way the light hit the cove in the afternoon. There were no ultimatums here, no sacrifices required, and no enemies waiting at the gates. The darkness of the Shin Syndicate had been replaced by the soft, filtering light of the Oregon mists. Tasha watched him as he played with Dahyun on the floor, the two of them surrounded by the quiet hum of a house that was finally a home. She felt the grief for her own lost son, Franklin, settling into a gentle, distant ache, a part of her history that gave her the strength to cherish the present without the fear of the future. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the room, Elias stood by the window, watching the waves. Tasha joined him, slipping her arm around his waist. They looked out at the vast, unending expanse of the ocean, a boundary that felt like a shield. They knew that the world they had left behind was still out there, that Jinho was likely still struggling to hold the fragments of the empire, and that the council was still presiding over their cold laws. But none of that mattered here. They were sanctuary souls, protected by a sacrifice that had been recognized by the oldest of fathers. They were free. "We should go for a walk on the beach," Tasha suggested, looking at the way the tide was retreating to reveal the tide pools. "Dahyun loves the sand." Elias nodded, reaching for his boots. "And the mist is gone. It's going to be a clear night. We might even see the stars." They walked down the narrow, winding path to the shore, the three of them silhouetted against the brilliant gold of the setting sun. Tasha held Dahyun's hand as the toddler took her first, tentative steps in the soft, wet sand, her laughter echoing against the cliffs. Elias walked beside them, his presence a steady, unwavering force, the dragon finally at rest in the cradle of his family. As the first star began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Tasha looked at the man and the child, her heart full of a love that had been forged in the most unthinkable way. They were a family of ghosts who had found the light, a single mother and a mafia boss who had traded a crown for a lullaby. The mists of Oregon had cleared, revealing a horizon that was finally bright and full of possibility. They stood at the edge of the world, free from the darkness, ready to face whatever came next, as long as they faced it together. The story that had begun with a shattered glass scream on a train had ended in the soft, rhythmic sigh of the Pacific, a transformation complete, a family born from mercy, and a life that was finally, beautifully, their own. Would you like me to help you brainstorm a spin-off story for baby Dahyun's future, or perhaps a prequel about the early days of the Shin Syndicate?